He crouched behind a broken choir stall and watched Abbot Martian press his palm flat to the altar while Brother Elias spoke a single clipped syllable beneath his breath. The palm left dust on the carved stone. Suspicion tightened the researcher's chest as he saw the movement. This was not a liturgical gesture he recognized, and the single murmured clause was not Latin from the breviary. He moved forward, fingers curling around a fallen scrap of parchment at his boot, and the scrap slid into view. A faded sigil and 3 words that forbade confession and exposure. The room reacted to that small paper, as if it were a thrown stone. He kept his head low and checked the candle flames by the altar edge. They did not tremble, but the smell of tallow and damp mortar filled his nostrils. The researcher had come to the priory to catalogue marginalia and to trace a rumor, not to witness oath-taking. Suspicion was his first tool. A quiet, mechanical distrust that made him note gestures, count syllables, and memorize orders. He folded the scrap inside his glove and let the moment extend only long enough to imprint the image of Martian's hand against the stone. By daylight, the priory presented its public face. Dogs in the yard, the novice sweeping the cloister, a bell for prime. The researcher kept his coat buttoned, his wool scarf hiding the brass of his pocket watch, and he methodically took his place in the scriptorium among benches and ink pots. He introduced himself not with his name but with a ledger request, and Scribe Lucia registered the request with a brief nod and a glance that measured his sleeves. She closed the chest of quills and said, "You want the older ledgers?" The researcher answered with a single sentence, and the ledger was produced. Lucia watched him as he turned pages. She had a hand callus near the index finger and a habit of tapping the hem of the parchment before copying a line. "Why do you look at the margins the way you do, sir?" He did not avoid the question, because margins lie where those in charge hide what they fear, he said. Lucia's eyes tightened. Lucia. I'm called Lucia. I copy what I'm ordered to copy. I keep my head. That short exchange moved the researcher from suspicion to pragmatic alliance. He needed a scribe inside the priory who could risk betraying official order. They worked in a small, cold room with a single high window and a rain-smeared ledge. Lucia set a fresh sheet and, under the table, slid him a wrapped bundle of copied marginal notes. He unwrapped it with steady hands and found a line of ciphered lettering that matched the sigil on the scrap he had taken from the crypt. The line included a reference to a relic and to binding by stone and ring. He read the words aloud once, carefully. Nulla confessio, nulla revelatio. Lucia flinched when he spoke them. What is it? A vow. The researcher pressed the phrase between thumb and forefinger and said, an oath that forbids confessional disclosure and forces silence on pain of ritual consequence. Lucia's fingers closed into a small fist. If Martian knows you take those words, he will call it heresy. If he knows you read them, he will call it treason. Her voice was low and practical. That practical calculation moved the researcher from curiosity to guarded alarm. They decided to copy the marginalia full and hide the copies within another book. Lucia worked with measured speed, while the researcher watched the priory's routines. Novices bringing bread, a lay brother dusting reliquaries, Brother Elias sweeping the nave with steady, tired strokes. The researcher kept a ledger record of time and place. At midday he walked the nave and found Martian standing with a group of older canons. Martian's voice was smooth as he addressed them. The researcher listened from a shadowed pillar. Obedience keeps the order whole. Martian, obedience keeps the people safe. We have duties the flock cannot bear to know, Brother Elias answered with a short line, so we bind with the old rite. Martian's reply was quiet and precise, yes. We do not speak it. We enforce it. The researcher's pulse quickened, not with fever but with the physical sensation of a knuckle tightening around a pen. He stepped forward. Abbot Martian, he said, using the name to hold attention. Martian turned slowly. You pry where peace should lie. Martian, the Church's order is older than your questions. Walk away and do not trouble us. The researcher, walk away. A vow that forbids confession touches every man who kneels. It is not private charity. It is a mechanism. Brother Elias straightened. Mechanism, he said. You stand in a church and call a vow a mechanism. The exchange grew sharp. Martian's lips thinned. They sparred with short lines. Martian, the altar hides a second oath. You hide power under stone. Power protects the flock. Martian, Brother Elias takes the oath for protection. Then answer one question. Who decides what must be hidden? The researcher. We do. Martian, we keep the relic sealed. The argument ended in forced civility. The researcher left with more questions, and the perfectly practical knowledge that Martian would not volunteer a ledger. That evening the researcher met Lucia again at the scriptorium under the pretense of repairing a damaged folio. Lucia led him to a shelf where she had placed the copied notes. They spread the papers on a long table, and Lucia pointed to an annotation in a thin, cramped hand. This hand is older than Martian's tenure, she said. It mentions a mortar beneath the altar and a ring. It warns that the ring binds with pressure, not words. The researcher traced the ink with a fingertip. He felt a faint grit of old mortar dust under the page, as if the book had been closed near the site itself. They worked through the cipher together. The researcher read aloud bits while Lucia wrote. Mortar sealed, sigil beneath, oath by ring. Break silence and the binding answers. Lucia's pen paused. Answers how? She asked. He tapped the paper and said, by pressure, a felt force, and by communal enforcement. The oath is neither only theological nor only legal. It is performed and maintained. A new sensation rose in him. Dread. The suspicion had become fear in the face of a physical mechanism. At dusk, the researcher followed Martian and Brother Elias across the cloister to a small walled garden. The air was cold against his face. He kept to the shadow of the wall and watched through latticework as a small council assembled. Martian, Elias, and two older canons whose faces were carved into patient stone by age. They spoke in elliptical phrases and gestures. He could not hear all words, but he noted one concrete action. Martian removed a ring from beneath his robes and set it on the stone table between them. Lucia had joined the circle unnoticed and slid beside the researcher, pressing a folded note into his palm. Do not be seen, she mouthed. This is where they decide. The researcher felt the paper like a relay. He watched the ring and his hands made notations on a scrap. The ring was plain, iron, dark, and bore a faint groove along its inner face. Elias touched the ring as if to test weight. The council spoke of obedience and protection, but a veiled threat landed when an older canon tapped the table and said, We have mouths. We also have measures. Martian's eyes held the researcher for an instant, and the researcher took the instant as a warning. He moved away, and the garden swallowed him into stone. At night he returned to the crypt where he had first seen the oath. The low crypt smelled of lime and wet stone. He lit a small lamp and knelt by the altar edge to see the engraving more clearly. He found a hairline seam in the mortar and scraped carefully with a knife. Something thin and brittle gave. He pried at the seam, and a carved sigil lay revealed, shallow and filled with dust. He placed the ring across the sigil as a test, and his lamplight caught a faint thread of sheen. Before he could move the ring, voices rose above in the nave and boots pounded down the stair. Martian's voice filled the crypt doorway. You were warned, Martian. Brother Elias stepped down with a torch and his face was set. The researcher stood with a scrap in hand. He did not flee. He placed the scrap on the altar and let Martian see its corner. Martian's eyes narrowed to an indistinct slit. They exchanged terse lines. Martian, the researcher, you use the ring to bind men beyond confession. You make secrecy a law. Martian, we do for necessity. Elias, we do for order. The researcher looked at Elias. Elias, why do you take this oath? Elias's jaw tightened. To keep my vow to the flock, he answered. To keep them from ruin. You would strip us naked before bandits and bishops. The researcher, then you accept a coercion you will pass on. Elias's breathing shortened. His hand rubbed his wrist. Martian motioned to the mortar. Come see what a ring does, he said. He pressed the iron ring into the carved sigil, and a pressure rose in the researcher's shoulders, like the weight of a packed chest against open ribs. The lamp flickered and a soundless force pressed along his scalp. He stumbled backward, tasting metal and dust. Lucia cried out from the doorway. The pressure receded as Martian withdrew the ring. The researcher felt something change in his body. a small, involuntary weakening of the knees and a bitter taste that clung to his tongue. He had suspected ritual enforcement, but he had not expected a physical response that registered in his muscles. That sensation moved him from dread into raw, immediate fear. Martian watched him with a calm that held a threat. "Do you feel bound, stranger, Martian?" The researcher folded his hands to stop them from shaking and said, "I felt pressure. I also felt a choice offered now as force. The choice cannot be left unrecorded." Martian's face did not change. He then pick. "Remain silent, and you remain useful, or you speak and we bind you to public shame. Which will you choose?" The researcher stared at the ring and then at the sigil. He felt Lucia at his shoulder. He felt Lucia's breath quick and thin. They argued in short exchanges. "Martian, you cannot make secrecy into law and then call it charity." The researcher, "You bind men to obey, never to tell. That is power. Power protects." Martian, "Power conceals sins the flock cannot bear to know. You make sins into tools." Abbot, the researcher, "Who polices you?" "We do, Martian. We are the police. We are the judges." The exchange tightened into a threatening rhythm. 3 rapid lines that ended with the abbot's small laugh. Lucia stepped forward. "Abbot Martian," she said, "there are ledger entries that predate your watch. They show fear, yes, but also a relic misplaced and then returned. The people below the altar paid a price for protection once. If you force secrecy, you force the same price again." Martian's fingers tightened around the ring. "And if the price is necessary?" he asked. Lucia's reply was a single, precise sentence. "Then we must let the people consent, not be compelled." Marcus's jaw moved. Brother Elias looked at Lucia with something like pity. The researcher searched the faces around the ring and saw not only authority but habit. Men who had learned to call coercion duty. He placed his hand on the altar, and with an action that surprised him, set the scrap of parchment where Martian could see the full sigil. "This ring answers to a ritual. It enforces silence. I will write what I have seen and I will hide the record. I will not publish it unless forced." Martian's eyes narrowed to a blade. They did not physically fight. Instead, Martian lifted the ring and spoke a sentence of authority that functioned as a legal threat. "Then live with that knowledge or face public penance. We will not be shamed by ruin." The researcher understood the mechanics. The council relied on secrecy maintained by ritual pressure and on the communal willingness to apply shame to violators. He realized that the system would not be stopped by evidence alone. In the cold corridor outside the crypt, Martian offered a final demand. "You may keep your scrap if you swear never to tell where it came from and to burn any copy if asked." The researcher saw the coercive logic and answered with the kind of carefully measured sentence he used when deciding which manuscripts to cite. "I will keep it only if I can keep a copy hidden and encoded. I will not allow you to make silence into law for everyone. I will not be your instrument of selective forgetting." Martian's face hardened. "Then you will be watched," he said. They did not bind him in that corridor. Instead, the abbot imposed a social consequence. Surveillance and a threat of communal punishment. The researcher felt a bitter, precise anger. He wrote down the words of the exchange in his pocket ledger and watched as Martian and Elias left, their cloaks brushing stone. Lucia touched his sleeve and mouthed, "Be careful. He will watch you." She did not say she would betray them. She did not promise more than her proximity. Before dawn, the researcher sat at his small desk in a rented room and began to copy the sigil into a private notebook. He drew the carving with a fine pen and then, beneath the line, wrote an encoded account of the ring's effect and Martian's words. He wrapped the original scrap in waxed linen and hid it in a false lining he had prepared inside his leather-bound notebook. The physical act of hiding felt like closing a wound. He paused often, tracing the letters with a fingertip and listening to his breath. The emotion that had driven him, suspicion, had shifted twice now. First into dread when the mortar and ring proved real, then into a pragmatic compromise when Martian offered surveillance rather than immediate violence. He wrote the compromise into his ledger as an active decision, not as resignation. He recorded the fact that he had promised nothing but secrecy outwardly while retaining a copy, At predawn, a small sound at his window made him look up. Lucia stood beyond the sill in the grey light, fingers gripping the stone. She whispered his name and said, "I have copied the ledger I promised. There are more notes, older hands than Martians, that speak of binding to protect and a relic mislaid." The researcher opened the notebook and showed her the concealed scrap. Lucia's eyes widened for a single honest blink. "What will you do?" "Lucia." He folded his hands and gave her a specific plan. He would encode the ledger in a cipher that only a few could read, deposit a copy with a trusted friend in a distant abbey, and continue to gather evidence until he could show a pattern that politicians or bishops could not ignore. Lucia's lips made a small line. "If Marchand finds out you hid it, he will call that betrayal," she said. "If he trails you, he will find the friend. If he binds you, your body will answer the oath as mine would if I took it." Her hand trembled when she said the last sentence. They did not argue poetry. They arranged practical things. A note for a messenger, a phrase to show as verification, a sealed folio to be hidden beneath a bed of mortar in a friend's cell. Each action tightened an invisible cord. This planning moved the researcher from anger into a cold resolution. He would preserve the record and try to build allies who could remove the ring or the relic. He also understood that his presence had already changed the priory. Martian would act differently now. Before Lucia left, he asked one direct question. "Lucia, why did you risk helping me?" She answered in 3 short sentences, "Because I copy the truth, not just what keeps me dry. Because I have seen the list of men who vanished into silence. Because I do not want the next to be my brother." Those lines were concrete and human. The researcher memorized them. They parted with no false promises. Lucia walked away along a path of damp stone, and she carried her risk back into the scriptorium. The researcher closed the window and held his notebook, feeling the waxed linen inside like a small, stubborn heart. He had recorded the oath's existence, proven its physical enforcement, and secured one copy. He had also been presented with a choice that was not his alone: publish and risk a communal rupture, or hide and allow the mechanism to remain in place. As the first bell called the priory to prime, a messenger arrived at his door with a sealed note from a distant abbey willing to take a coded folio for safekeeping. The researcher sealed his copy and watched the messenger leave. He felt that the balance had changed. Secrecy now had a counterweight. He tucked the sealed folio into his satchel and, with a final line in his notebook, wrote the date, the names present, and a word that would matter later. Sealed, he closed the book, eased the waxed parcel into the lining, and set the ledger under his cloak. He did not crown the night with any pronouncement. Instead, he left the priory by a side gate while the bells still pulled at the air. A boy swept straw outside the gate and looked up as the researcher passed. The boy said, "Sir." The researcher stopped and slid the sealed folio under his cloak. "Be careful tonight," the boy said. The researcher only nodded. He walked into the road with the leather book at his side, and with his knowledge hidden but not destroyed. The oath remained beneath the altar, and the mortar still held its ring, but a copy of the binding now slept in linen within a foreign abbey's chest. The chapter closed with the researcher writing a final line and sealing a second copy. The small act of concealment itself becoming the quiet hinge on which future exposure might turn. He snatched the parchment from Brother Elias's trembling hands as the candle flame guttered and wax spat small drops onto the table. Suspicion tightened his chest. The researcher moved before his reason finished listing consequences. Brother Elias lunged, fingers clawing at vellum, and a wooden stool toppled into the scribal rack. "Elias!" Abbot Martian's voice cut the room like a struck bell. The scriptorium held its breath around the sound of chairs scraping. Within those first seconds the problem stood bare, a hidden sigil and a name not in any ledger, and men who would kill to keep it secret. He had begun the night with a note. The broken choir stall, the abbot's palm pressed to stone, dust on carved grooves. That observation from the cloister returned now as a concrete lead. The researcher kept the sheet folded under his palm and let Brother Elias's struggle end in a stunted cough. He kept his hands where they could be seen and let his eyes do the searching he could not do with words. His body stayed small and deliberate. His voice waited. "What is that?" Martian demanded, stepping forward. He smelled of stale candle, fat, and boiled wine. His robe hung neatly, the private mark hidden inside the fold of his sleeve. He looked at the table and at the scrap of parchment, and for a long second he tried denial. Brother Elias gasped, "It is nothing for you, Abbot." A study note. He pulled away as if the word "note" could close the breach. "Elias, Martian, leave the scroll." He used the name like a command. The researcher watched Elias's hands. They trembled in a way that said there was more than study here. Suspicion shifted into urgency. The researcher allowed his jaw to tighten so his mouth wouldn't stammer. He had to force the next move so the monastery's leadership could not arrange the scene into a contest of words they would win. He plainly and quiet, "Show me the margin." The words were a small demand. They carried his role, not an accuser yet, but an examiner. Elias blinked. "What for?" he whispered. The abbot's gaze landed on the researcher. Martian's lips curved in a way that dropped warmth from his voice. "He has a right to inspect our stocks for the Chronicle." The researcher heard the calculation. "Provide cover, take control." Elias let the page go. The researcher opened the parchment. Ink had faded almost to brown. A looped sigil crouched in the lower, left margin, executed with a hand that wavered then steadied. Beneath the sigil, written in a cramped running hand, was a name that did not appear in any monastery ledger the researcher had seen. Hadrianus Prioris. The name matched a whispered rumor and notations he'd found in a damaged folio weeks earlier. A shift moved through the room. The other scribes turned their heads, hands frozen over quills. The candle that stood at the table cast a hard edge to faces. The researcher felt a second emotion unspool behind the suspicion, the thread of fear. The fear did not paralyze him, it made his movements sharper. He touched the sigil with a fingertip to read the pressure of the stroke, and the ink left a faint smear on his nail. The smear smelled of boiled tannin, not the sweet oils of illuminated pigments. It was practical, not decorative. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Elias, from a commission." Elias' voice thin, "From a ledger collection for the priory. I copied a prayer and margin notes." His eyes avoided the abbot. Martian's jaw tightened. "A prayer? Which one?" He stepped toward the archive alcove, and the researcher noticed a line of dust on the floor that suggested recent passage. It was a small thing, but it added to a growing map of when and where people moved through the house. Elias's hand found the edge of the table. It was for Prior Hadrian. "He left it with me." The name dropped like a stone. The researcher felt the room tilt. Not in the abstract way of mood, but in the calculation of power. Prior Hadrian's authority had been a rumor. This linked him to a sealed emblem and a sigil. The abbot's eyes narrowed. Hadrian is entrusted with the relic chest. He would not bring names lightly. The statement carried a threat under its civility. The researcher watched for the shift from denial to menace. It came not in a flourish, but in a small, practiced movement. Martian reached under his robe and touched the hidden crest sewn into the lining. The motion signaled control. The researcher understood that exposure would not be met with argument. It would be met with countermeasures. Outside the scriptorium, footsteps came fast and contained. A shadow passed at the jamb. Sister Magdalene's hand appeared at the door before she entered fully, her face in the candle glow like an old, patient ledger. She did not look surprised. She carried a narrow strip of vellum folded into a slip and a key wound on a twine loop. She moved to the researcher and dropped the key into his palm. Her fingers brushed his. The touch was quick and precise. Her mouth did not open. The researcher felt a new shift, from fear into a slender certainty about what he must do. The key allowed a choice that was now unavoidable. "Magdalene." "Martian, you should not be here." There was reproach in his tone, but not cruelty. He kept cruelty for those who failed him. She looked at Martian and then at Elias. "I wrote what I saw in the margins," she said. Her voice had measured clarity. "I have not yet told anyone else. I only follow the book." Her words placed her on the side of a different authority. The obligation to truth. The researcher folded the parchment and concealed it inside his coat. He slipped the key into the pocket that held his watch. The decision had been made before he had time to argue with consequence. He would follow the next act. He would see what the oath bound. Martian's expression cooled. He called out, "Hadrian!" The name echoed into the corridor, and the door to his private chamber banged shut. The room emptied in a practiced shuffle. The researcher felt the tension grow into something clinical. He and Sister Magdalene left last. She pointed with her chin to a stair behind the scriptorium that wound down. She mouthed the direction to a private chapel. Her gesture was small, but it was a plan. They moved through the cloister where earlier the researcher had crouched behind a broken stall. The broken wood was a marker of an earlier surveillance, and he raced the memory against the present. He had watched Abbot Martian press his palm to the altar in that space days before. That image had been the seed of suspicion. Now the seed sprouted into a plan. Watch the ritual, record the oath, discover the enforcement. They reached a narrow corridor with stone benches. A torch flared shallowly in the wall. The researcher held the key between finger and thumb and felt the metal's cold plainness. He felt a quick, physical reaction when he thought of Prior Hadrian's name. A shallow tightening at his throat and a steadying of his hands. That was not dramatic, it was the count of breath and muscle. They unlocked a door beneath the chapel's foundation. The lock yielded with a soft complaint. Sister Magdalene slipped inside without a sound. The researcher followed and paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The chapel beyond was low and private. A blocky altar rose in the center with a cloth drawn over it. 3 candles burned at its corners. He could hear the muffled cadence of a single chant from somewhere above, but below the sound was replaced with the scrape of robes and the rustle of feet. Abbot Martian, Prior Hadrian, and Brother Elias assembled like officers at a table. The researcher pressed himself against the rough mortar and watched. The first external event came when Elias moved to lift the cloth from the altar. He did it with careful fingers, and beneath the cloth lay a small case of dark wood. The prior produced a ring and a scratched token. The gesture was deliberate. The exchange of objects rather than words. A hush fell. The researcher felt an emotion shift. Where suspicion had been steady and fear tactical, a new clarity arrived. He understood what the oath secured. The men did not swear to doctrine but to guardianship, protection of a relic and an agreement with an outside order. The prior's mouth formed the words of the oath in a clipped formula. They were not liturgy and did not match any canonical vow the researcher knew. I bind myself, Hadrian, to keep the chest sealed and to answer only to those who wear this mark. I bind myself, Martian answered, and his hand moved to the embroidered crest inside his sleeve. Elias repeated the formula with a voice like a struck reed. The researcher listened for the enforcement clause. The prior closed his eyes and then pressed a finger to his lip and lifted the ring to his mouth. The small community had performed secret rites before history recorded them. The researcher felt a twist of betrayal. Clergy sworn to conceal, clergy sworn to an order beyond the altar. He had proof now, but the moment of revelation became danger. Hadrian's head turned as if he had heard a breath behind the stone. The researcher did not move. He could not afford movement that would draw hands. Instead, he reached into his pocket and palmed the folded parchment. He had to steal a token, as planned. His fingers found the scratch of a small ring left on the altar lip, where a communion had once left its mark. He moved like the scratching of a mouse and lifted the ring into his palm. A twig of noise betrayed him then, a subtle creak in the mortar that was not rhythm of the chapel. The prior's eyes opened wider. Martian's hand flicked 2 inches toward his belt. Elias turned like a man convulsed. Judgment shifted into immediate threat. The researcher froze. He heard his pulse as blunt percussion behind his ears. The fear was physical, breath quick, hands damp. He could have fled then, but flight would mean losing proof and abandoning Sister Magdalene. He clenched his jaw and watched for the precise moment to act. The prior spoke, but before the words fully left him, a muffled scrape came from the corridor. A sweep of lantern light crossed the chapel's threshold. The researcher realized with a cold clarity that someone was coming to answer Martian's earlier summons. The external event, arrival at the chapel, forced a mid-chapter cliffhanger. Would their presence save the men or unmask them? The door opened and 2 lay brothers pushed in, faces white from sleep. They saw the lifted cloth and the exposed case, and they saw the 3 clerics at the altar. One of them flinched, stepped back, and dropped his lamp. The flame nearly died, sputtering wax. Martian took the moment and stepped forward, voice low and authoritative. "Leave us. Send Brother Thomas to the infirmary and lock the north gate. This is between the priory's eyes tonight." His orders were quick, unargued. The lay brothers obeyed, bewildered. The researcher used the scramble to move. He and Sister Magdalene slipped from the shadows and pushed past a column. He pressed his palm to the altar and palmed a small wooden token carved with the same sigil as the parchment. He felt the wood's grain, saw the nick where a ring had struck it, and knew the shape would serve as witness. They backed away and retraced the corridor. Footsteps banged above them like a measured drum. Martian's voice carried through the stairwell, calm and edged. "If anything leaves this place, we will find it." They stepped into the cloister and froze as Prior Hadrian approached the stair. He stopped within reach but did not look up. His silhouette was a block against the moonlight in the courtyard. He checked the gate. The researcher felt the final emotional shift in the chapter. From fear and clarity into resolution. He would not confront the monastery with accusations. He would document, preserve proof, and return when his case was strengthened. Sister Magdalene moved with brisk care. "Take this," she said, pressing a small slip of vellum into his palm. "There are more marginal notes, old pages in the archive that name places and men. I will copy them tonight." Her voice had the accuracy of a scribe and the urgency of someone who had made a decision. The researcher nodded. He slid the wooden token beneath his shirt. He did not say vows out loud. He felt instead the weight of a choice made. To carry this knowledge forward, to place evidence where it could be read and judged. They escaped through a narrow postern as the first cock crowed. Outside, the sky was a washed strip of iron. He and Sister Magdalene ran along the roofline, then dropped to the cloister gate. She produced a rope and a small hand-forged postern key. The researcher heard the echo of Martian's last instruction behind them, an order that sounded like a sealed mouth, and he smelled smoke from a brazier where a night watchman stirred. At the gate, Sister Magdalene paused and looked at him. "You will not name me," she said. The researcher answered with an inclination of the head. He understood how precarious any promise was. His mouth formed a reply he did not speak aloud. He would not betray her unless evidence required exposure. He thanked her by touch, a brief press of fingers, and took the key. He moved through the postern. The small wooden token in his shirt reminded him of the weight of the covenant he'd seen. He felt resolve in his shoulders, not as a proclamation, but as an actual tightening of posture and steadier breath. On the other side of the gate, he paused and took stock. He had the parchment, a carved token, a key, and Sister Magdalene's promise to copy marginalia. He had heard the oath and seen the exchange. He had seen the abbot's hand hide his crest. He had proof that the monastery's highest authority was bound to secrets outside its liturgical walls. He tucked the items deeper into his coat and moved away from the priory. He did not run. He walked with a pace meant to keep him steady for what came next, cataloging, cross-referencing, and deciding whom to trust. He had already chosen his first act. The researcher would not confront the men publicly until he could place this token within a set of corroborating texts. The chapter closes on the concrete action that propels the next. He opened his notebook, wrote a single line, Hadrianus Prioris, then sealed the page with a pressed fragment of the carved token and slid the stubbed key across the margin. He left the priory lane and tucked the notebook beneath his coat as the bell struck the hour and a porter opened a shuttered window. The night swallowed his figure and the evidence he carried, but it did not swallow the choices he'd already made. He forced the side door and stepped into the abbot's private chamber as palms pressed to the carved altar, the clandestine ritual already unfolding. Suspicion drove his movement. The researcher moved with the same narrow focus he had the night he crouched behind the broken choir stall and watched Abbot Martian press his palm to the altar while Brother Ilias spoke a single clipped syllable. He had learned the sound of small betrayals. That memory made his steps quick and hard now. Within 2 heartbeats, he saw 3 figures bent in the alcove, hands flat on stone and faces lit by a guttering candle. The central problem was visible. A secret rite was happening, and the men who maintained the monastery's authority were bound in it. He did not pause to name the moral question. He crossed the chamber floor and shut the door with a deliberate hand. His coat brushed the heavy wool scarf at his throat. He kept his spectacles in place and let the brass pocket watch sit cold against his palm. He had sneaked into the scriptorium before and grabbed a parchment from Brother Elias, the paper that had smelled of spattered wax and fear, and that theft had led him here. Now faced again with the same handwriting and the same carved sigil, his suspicion hardened into action. "What are you doing here?" Abbot Martian's voice was low, steady. Martian stepped forward before the researcher could reach the altar. Martian's face stayed composed, but the researcher watched the way his fingers flexed at his sides. The researcher answered with a single movement. He reached for the folded parchment on the altar's lip. Archdeacon Hildebrand moved faster. He caught the researcher's wrist and twisted, bringing a bright sting to the bone. A chair scraped. Brother Thomas appeared at the doorway, breathing hard. The researcher yanked free with his other hand and exposed the parchment. "The parchment," he said, voice clipped, not holding back the accusation in the air. Martian's gaze cut to the sigil, then to the researcher. "Put that down, Martian, Brother Elias. You will explain how this came to be in your keeping." "Thomas, hold the door." Martian's command set the room into motion. Hildebrand's fingers remained along the researcher's forearm like a clamp. The researcher felt anger rise in his throat, precise and hot. He kept his jaw set. He did not shout. He did as he had in the scriptorium. He opened the fold and let the candlelight catch the neat lines. The oath read in terse Latin terms: guardianship, silence, bloodless seal. The sigil matched the marginal mark he'd traced earlier on the stolen sheet. The parchment did not excuse itself with metaphor. It said plainly who was bound and how. Brother Elias's shoulders melted. Elias had been trembling in the scriptorium. Here, the candlelight revealed a tremor in his chin. Elias began, voice small. Elias pressed his palms to his chest as if to quiet his pulse. The researcher did not let the silence last. "Brother Elias," the researcher, keeping his voice flat, "you swore this." Elias nodded once, a single broken movement. "You signed it beneath the altar before Martian's hand." Elias's eyes found the sigil and he turned away. Prior Roderick's footsteps fell in the corridor, then, sharp, alarmed. The warden at the outer gate called out. The prior pushed past Thomas and the wardens, the torchlight carving his jaw into a hard plane. "What is this disturbance at midnight?" he demanded. His question landed like a steel bar across the room's tension. Before anyone could answer, Martian stepped between them. He looked at Prior Roderick with measured patience. "Roderick, be quiet a moment and listen. This is not a scandal to fling into the cloister corridors. This is a charge of sacred order." The researcher watched the prior's eyes flick to the parchment, then to Elias. The prior's posture shifted, but his face did not harden. He waited for proof. The researcher forced his reply. "This is a secret oath, prior. It binds men to silence about a writ and a relic. It cannot be called order when it hides names and shields lay patrons from inquiry." His words landed, and the room tightened. Martian's nostrils flared. Hildebrand's hand tightened on his arm. The researcher felt his pulse, a steady drum beneath his collar. Martian moved closer to the altar and put both palms on the carved stone, the same motion the researcher had seen earlier from his hiding place. "You do not understand the purpose, Martian." He spoke without haste. "We swear to guard what the monastery guards. We bind ourselves to prevent scandal that would destroy souls and sacred things." His tone aimed to reframe the discovery as duty rather than conspiracy. The researcher let the accusation hang. He had listened to Martian explain similar rhetoric before, in the margins of ledgers and in curt notes. He watched Martian's mouth for the flash of a lie. Instead, Martian looked tired, as if years of looking after relics and patronage had worn him thin. The researcher had 2 choices in a moment of pressure: push the accusation and risk being seized, or use the parchment as leverage for answers. He chose the second, then answer a simple question. The researcher who else enforces this oath? Brother Elias made no move to evade. The candle flame caught the hollow beneath his eyes. Two nobles, Elias whispered, Lord Audran of Crossford and Sir Gervase of Lomer. They have standing debts and influence in town. They expect silence in return for protection. Elias's hand shook and the parchment slipped from his fingers to the stone. 3 external shifts occurred in quick succession. The prior's face lost color, wardens exchanged a glance, and Thomas took a step back toward the door. The researcher's suspicion changed again. Doubt creased his mouth where suspicion had been. If nobles enforced the oath, the scale of the secret extended beyond cloister politics. This was not only clerical concealment. The researcher felt his pulse tilt toward something sharper than anger. A pragmatic fear for his own safety. Martian's voice folded quiet into the room. Audran and Gervase are our patrons. Do you expect us to invite their ruin to satisfy curiosity? His hand fell to the altar rim as if the stone itself steadied him. Hildebrand, who minutes before had seized the researcher, now stood rigid and alert. The prior stepped forward, Martian, Roderick, addressing him like a judge. If there is a writ that binds men, does it bind the monastery to hide crime? Roderick's rhythm was clipped. He turned his head and looked at Elias, then at the researcher. Brother Elias, declare what you know under oath to the chapter. We require truth. Elias's shoulders sagged once more. Elias spoke, voice thin. I bound myself to silence to preserve a patron's name. I feared the patron's vengeance. I was told to watch the relic, and in exchange I swore no truth would be spoken that cut those men. I have done as I was told. His hands opened and closed against the stone. The prior stared at Elias, then at Martian. For a long beat no one spoke. The researcher listened to the scrape of Hildebrand's foot and to the candle's gutter. He felt anger lift again, this time sharpened into an unwilling clarity. He had wanted to expose the oath, and now that the oath's reach had been named, he had to decide how to force the institution to answer. Martian moved then, in a way that demanded attention. He crossed from the altar to the threshold, putting himself between the researcher and the candlelight. There is a relic, Martian plainly. A reliquary fragment brought here under the previous abbot. It carries a ruinous claim if revealed. We took a vow to guard that relic, and to guard the writ that instructs its keeping. The writ names the patrons who must be spared to keep peace between church and local power. You are choosing to break peace. Martian's argument carried the weight of administrative logic. It appealed to preservation rather than sentiment. The researcher realized that Martian had shifted the stakes. This was not only about secrecy, but about institutional survival. He sharpened his mouth. Is that order or collusion? He asked. Hildebrand's jaw tightened. Martian's eyes flicked to the researcher and settled with a hard kindness. Either swear it yourself under this stone, or the parchment is suppressed, and you will leave and never speak of it again. Martian, without raising his voice, take the oath and survive. Refuse and be cast out, or worse, by men who will not tolerate exposure. The ultimatum landed like a physical blow. The researcher felt breath caught in his throat. The room narrowed to the carved sigil and the faces around it. The emotional current shifted again. His suspicion and anger folded into a tense, calculated calm. He realized he could not win with brute force. He also realized Man expected him to choose between moral purity and bodily survival. The researcher had come to the monastery to uncover truth, but he had not prepared for the immediate price demanded for that truth. He lowered his hand and approached the altar on a slow foot. He put a finger to the sigil where Elias's ink had darkened the stone. He needed to seem to consent, to create a window. Then, with the practiced ease of someone who had once seized a parchment at the scriptorium, he slid the original page against his coat beneath the folds. The motion was small, surgical. Hildebrand's grip eased a degree. Martian watched the movement and did not move to stop it. The researcher pressed his lips tight and made the oath gesture with his finger, touching the sigil as the others had. The candlelight threw his face into half, shadow. He felt the weight of the moment in his fingers, feigned assent, and the theft of the very document that proved his case. He stepped back and breathed as if setting down a burden. There was a quiet of motion. Martian inclined his head and let the scene seem to close. The researcher could feel his pulse in his throat. He kept his face neutral. Brother Elias slipped away when the other's attention turned inward. He brushed past the researcher with a look of something like relief and something like terror mixed. In the corridor, Elias halted a few paces and, in a voice meant only for the researcher, whispered two names and a single phrase. They collect favors. They keep wounds open. Do not trust any patron's kindness. The researcher followed Elias into the cold stone corridor. His hands were steady, but his skin felt thin. Elias's confession was not enough. The researcher needed verification and leverage. He had the original parchment now hidden, and he had Elias's trembling testimony. He also had a new, urgent fear. If Audran and Gervais enforced the oath beyond the cloister, the monastery could not expose them alone. If he wanted change, he would have to force institutional mechanisms to act. He returned to the crypt beneath the altar at first light. He sat on the cold flagstone and opened his worn leather notebook. The rescued parchment lay within his coat like a small, dangerous thing. He set it on the stone and traced the sigil with a fingertip until his skin warmed. He thought of the earlier nights. The hiding behind choir stalls, the rush in the scriptorium. He felt a shift inside, from suspicion to resolve. The choice he had made at the altar had been a feint. Now he had to decide whether to expose the writ publicly and risk blood, or to bury the truth and spare living reputations. He had seen how Prior Roderick had reacted. He had seen Martian's attempt to frame the oath as necessary. The researcher could not bring himself to accept institutional protecting of crimes, but he also could not pretend that exposing two nobles would not cause violence. His hands hovered over a pen. He chose a third path, public record without public blame. He would create a copy of the parchment, annotate it with context and with witnesses, and place it where a neutral ecclesiastical authority could be compelled to investigate without immediate public spectacle. He wrote single, precise sentences in his notebook, names, dates, the ritual details, Elias's whispered explanation. He made no verdict. He set down only observable facts and the parchment's original wording. Then he turned to the marginal note he had learned to craft in the scriptorium. A formal request for a chapter hearing, inked in the researcher's hand and addressed to Prior Roderick, with a copy to the neighboring archdeacon's clerk. He sealed the packet with wax and the signet ring he wore, the plain crest now serving as a trial instrument rather than an emblem of status. When he returned to the chapter house, the room smelled of wet wool and boiled coffee. Martian and Hildebrand waited at the table. Prior Roderick sat between them with the copied parchment already in hand. His face had the hard look of a man who had been forced to choose a path in an hour. The researcher set his notebook before Roderick and pushed the sealed packet forward. Prior Roderick, the researcher, I will not smear names into town. I will not hand this to laymen first. I will present the facts to chapter and to the archdeacon under proper inquiry. If you refuse to convene a lawful hearing within 3 days, I will deliver a copy to the bishop in the neighboring see. He kept his voice steady. The researcher counted on Roderick's institutional pride. The prior's fingers closed on the wax seal. Roderick did not speak immediately. He read the sealed note, then looked up at Martian. There was a slow clarity that moved across his face. Martian, you swore to guard, and in guarding you may have broken the rules that govern confession and counsel. We shall convene a hearing. Brother Thomas, prepare the chapter records. Brother Elias will relate what he knows before us. You, Martian, will answer before the chapter. Roderick's tone held an authority that left no room for simple dismissal. Martian's hands clenched at the table. Prior, you cannot summon Audran and Gervais to account without endangering our monastery's standing, he said. His argument tried to push the prior into conservatism. The prior shook his head. The monastery stands by rule, not by secret bargains. Roderick, if you have kept silence to shield the powerful, you answer. If the writ exists, it shall be examined. We will not submit to patronage in place of law. His line of reply carried the shape of judgment. Martian looked from Roderick to the researcher, then to Elias, who had re-entered and stood with his head lowered. There was a long breath Martian drew. He looked like a man who had been forced to drop an old garment he had worn until it frayed. "Very well," he said, "call the hearing." "I will comply." His voice broke once, and he laid his palms on the table. The hearing convened 2 days later in the chapter house with the monastery's records present. The researcher presented the parchment, the sealed copy, and his notes. He spoke only to evidence and witnesses. Brother Elias gave his testimony with short sentences and a shaking voice. Prior Roderick pointed questions. Martian answered with explanations that sometimes slipped into admission. He had concealed the writ to hold peace with patrons who kept the monastery fed and sheltered in times of poor harvest. In the end, the chapter voted. Martian would be removed from administrative duties and placed under penance. The monastery would produce a formal report to the neighboring see for a full ecclesiastical investigation into Audran and Gervais. The writ would be recorded under seal in the cathedral archive pending that inquiry. When the decision was read, Brother Elias fell to his knees. He wrapped his hands around his face and wept in a single hard sound. The researcher stepped back and felt a swell of weariness and relief move through him together. The action had consequences. Martian lost the authority he had wielded. Elias preserved his life but had to do penance. The patrons faced an uncertain legal future. None of it was neat. 2 days later, a clerk from the archdeacon's office arrived at the monastery with a sealed summons for Audran and Gervais. The summons was not a screaming public exposure. It was a formal canonical process. The researcher watched Audran's messenger hand the seal to Prior Roderick and saw the man's face tighten. He felt a precise satisfaction. The oaths apparatus had been dismantled without a riot in the courtyard. He had chosen process over spectacle, fact over revenge. At dawn on the day the summons left, he returned to the crypt beneath the stone altar. He opened his worn notebook and slipped the rescued parchment into its back pocket. He wrote a single line beneath the wax seal he had used on the packet. For archive, if required by judgment. Then he closed the notebook and placed it inside the iron chest used for relic registration. He turned the iron key once. The click sounded firm in the crypt's small hush. He had not taken the hidden oath Martian had pressed upon him. He had not sworn to silence. He had taken instead a different oath, written with ink and sealed with process. To record, to present, to insist on lawful inquiry. That decision changed his life in small, concrete ways. He would now be known as the man who brought the writ to chapter attention, and some friends and patrons would withdraw their plates. He would also live free of the particular weight of complicity. Brother Elias stayed at the monastery under penance. Martian left administrative office and was assigned to a hermitage for a season of atonement. His sphere of control diminished. Prior Roderick's standing rose quietly because he had chosen to use canon law rather than cloak. The 2 nobles were summoned and, within months, compelled to answer before the archdeacon's court. Their defenses cited necessity and protection, but the process revealed enough impropriety that both agreed to a form of restitution to avoid protracted scandal. The researcher received no public honor. He spent a week copying the chapter's minutes into his notebook and then returned to other research, but the monastery's corridors no longer held the same guarded nods. On the 3rd morning after the hearing, the researcher met Brother Elias in the refectory. Elias's hands had stopped trembling. He lifted his head and met the researcher's gaze. "Why did you not expose them to the townsfolk, Elias?" His voice had a new steadiness. "Because I wanted the monastery to answer by its rules, not by rumor," the researcher replied. "If I had thrown the names into the square, the men who protect themselves with swords would have answered with swords. This way an inquiry could form and papers could be sealed. It is not clean, but it closes the door on immediate blood." He watched Elias absorb the answer. Elias nodded slowly. "I thought silence would keep people safe. I see now it kept people in debt." "Thank you, Elias," sounding like a man who had learned to name something he had been ashamed to speak. The researcher did not accept thanks the way a hero might. He gave a brief, tired half smile and returned to the chapter archives. He copied the sealed writ into his private register and added a marginal note. Preserve context. Do not weaponize. The words were deliberate and practical. They were not a moral flourish. Weeks passed. The Archdeacon's Court published a restrained summary that removed the most dangerous specifics from the public record, while ensuring that the writ could no longer be used to shield wrongdoing. The monastery received a rebuke for its failure to report, and Martian's removal stood. The researcher watched the slow administrative machinery grind in a direction he had nudged it, and he felt the residue of his earlier fear shift into something that resembled relief and fatigue. He returned one last time to the crypt before leaving the monastery for the road. He opened the iron chest and took out his notebook. By the single candle he checked the sealed packet once more. Then he placed both the notebook and the original parchment into the chest and closed it. He turned the key twice, then once more for emphasis. The final clack was not a flourish. It was a deliberate closure. He set the key into the pocket of his vest and walked out into the morning, the weight of the wax in his pocket, as plain as any relic. He did not feel triumphant, he felt accountable. He had forced an institution to obey its own procedures and had preserved living men from an immediate violent reprisal. Brother Elias remained within the monastery, doing penance and tending the reliquary. Martian took a quieter life of study, absent from disciplinary authority. Prior Roderick returned to his duties, visibly wearied, but steady. The nobles answered to the archdeacon's process and adjusted their dealings. On the road away from the cloister, the researcher put his spectacles into their case and pulled up his collar against a chill wind. He walked without haste toward the coaching road and the next archive that might hold another half-hidden relic, aware now of the cost that knowledge demanded. He had not sworn the secret oath beneath the altar. Instead, he had bound himself to another set of practices, to record, to present, to seek lawful remedy. The iron key rested in his pocket, and the notebook's spine creaked once as he shouldered his pack. A cart creaked on the lane. A dog barked in the distance. Those small sounds grounded him as he passed into the town and beyond. The final act of the chapter was concrete. He had locked the chest, sealed evidence according to canon law, and walked away with the knowledge that the monastery would not use that writ again to shield wrongdoing.